I've watched this happen thousands of times, both in my own life and in the lives of people I've invested in, worked with, or advised. There is a very real shift that happens after the first $10,000, not because 10,000 is a magic number, and not because it suddenly makes you rich, it doesn't. But it changes how money feels, and that psychological shift changes behavior. And behavior, over time, matters far more than the number itself. Before that first 10,000, money feels fragile. Every expense feels heavy. Every mistake feels permanent. You're constantly aware of what you don't have, and most of your financial energy goes into survival and avoidance. Avoiding overdrafts, avoiding unexpected bills, avoiding risk at all costs. That mindset is completely understandable, because when resources are limited, the margin for error is thin. One wrong move can set you back months, so people become cautious, sometimes overly cautious, not because they lack ambition, but because the consequences of mistakes feel unbearable. What changes after the first 10,000 isn't the math, it's the margin. For the first time, you experience a buffer. You can make a small mistake and recover. You can pay an unexpected expense without panic. You can think in weeks and months instead of days. That shift alone reduces stress, and when stress drops, decision-making improves. You stop reacting purely emotionally and start thinking more strategically. That's the beginning of financial clarity. A lot of people misunderstand this point. They think the goal is the money itself. It's not. The goal is the optionality that money provides. $10,000 doesn't buy luxury, but it buys breathing room. And breathing room changes how you evaluate risk, opportunity, and time. Before that point, time feels like an enemy. You're racing against bills, deadlines, and obligations. After that point, time starts to feel like an asset you can use more deliberately. I remember early in my career when I crossed that threshold myself. I didn't suddenly feel wealthy. I felt calmer. I stopped checking my balance obsessively. I stopped making purely defensive decisions. I started asking better questions. Not, how do I avoid losing this? But, how can I use this intelligently? That's a subtle but powerful shift. It's the moment money stops owning you emotionally and starts becoming a tool. This is also where many people make their first real mistake. They assume that because they feel more secure, they should immediately take big risks. That's not what this phase is about. The first $10,000 is not for gambling. It's for learning how you behave when pressure is lower. Do you rush into things? Do you freeze? Do you chase returns? Do you avoid decisions altogether? This is where self-awareness becomes more valuable than returns. Another misconception is that $10,000 should be invested aggressively to make it grow fast. That's not the point either. Growth matters, but behavior matters more. At this stage, the most valuable return is not financial, it's cognitive. You're learning how money moves, how long things take, how compounding works, and how emotions interfere with logic. Those lessons, learned early and cheaply, are worth far more than a few percentage points of return. What also changes after the first 10,000 is how you perceive opportunity cost. Before, holding cash feels safe. You're afraid to let it go because it took so much effort to build. After, you begin to understand that money sitting still has a cost too. You start to see that doing nothing is still a decision, and often not a neutral one. This doesn't mean you abandon caution. It means you start evaluating trade-offs instead of absolutes. I see people all the time who never make it past this stage because they keep resetting themselves to zero. They spend impulsively. They take reckless bets, or they let lifestyle creep eat away at their buffer. The first $10,000 is fragile not because it's small, but because it's new. It requires discipline to protect not just the money, but the mindset it creates. Lose that, and you're back to reacting instead of planning. There's also a time component people overlook. Building the first 10,000 takes the longest, not in hours worked, but in learning curve. You're figuring out income, expenses, habits, and trade-offs all at once. After that, progress often accelerates, not because things get easier, but because you're no longer starting from chaos. You have structure, and structure compounds. This is where I want to be very clear. If you're below that threshold, you're not failing. You're in the hardest part, the part where effort feels disproportionate to results. That's normal. The danger is internalizing the struggle as incompetence. It's not. It's friction. And friction decreases as systems form. The first $10,000 is less about success and more about stability. Once stability exists, your relationship with money matures. You start thinking in terms of allocation instead of survival. You ask where money should live, what role it should play, and how liquid it needs to be. You begin to separate short-term needs from long-term goals. This is the foundation of real financial strategy. Without it, every decision feels urgent. With it, decisions can be paced. I've built businesses, invested across cycles, and watched fortunes rise and fall. The people who succeed long-term aren't the ones who chased the biggest returns early. They're the ones who built control early. Control over spending, control over emotion, control over decision-making. The first $10,000 is where that control is tested and refined. There's another subtle shift that happens here. You stop measuring progress only by income. You start measuring it by retention. How much do I keep? How efficiently do I use what I earn? That's a professional mindset. High income without retention is noise. Moderate income with discipline is leverage. This realization alone changes trajectories. After this point, money stops feeling like a scoreboard and starts feeling like infrastructure. Something you build on, not something you chase. That's when long-term thinking becomes possible. Not because you suddenly have foresight, but because you're no longer constantly under threat. Scarcity narrows vision. Stability widens it. Let me also say what this threshold does not mean. It does not mean you're immune to mistakes. It does not mean markets can't hurt you. It does not mean discipline is optional. In fact, this is where discipline matters most, because complacency becomes the new risk. Feeling comfortable too early can